In the world of music, there are compositions that inspire, pieces that move the soul, and then there are those that should never be played. Adrian Carter didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe that a simple arrangement of notes could change a man's fate. But that was before he found the Lost Symphony. It started on a rainy afternoon, inside a forgotten bookstore on the outskirts of Vienna. The kind of place where time had stopped, where dust clung to the spines of books like a whisper of the past. Adrian wasn't looking for anything in particular, just an escape from a storm outside. But fate has a way of finding those who aren't searching. Tucked between two crumbling manuscripts, he found it, a single, yellowed sheet of music. The ink had faded with age, the notes carefully inscribed by a steady but unfamiliar hand. At the bottom, there was a name, one he had never heard before. Matthias von Richter. Adrian was no historian, but he knew his composers. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, men who had shaped the world of music. But this name? It meant nothing. And yet, the moment he touched the parchment, a strange sensation coursed through him. It was subtle, like the feeling of a melody just on the edge of memory. Familiar yet unknown. He purchased the sheet for next to nothing, the elderly shopkeeper regarding him with an expression that was almost pitying. "That music," the man murmured, "is best left unplayed." Adrian smiled, thinking it was a simple superstition. If only he had listened. That night, in his small apartment, Adrian sat before his grand piano, the sheet resting on the stand. The melody was complex but beautiful, an intricate dance of sorrow and longing. As his fingers pressed against the keys, the first note echoed through the room, and something shifted. The candlelight flickered. The air grew heavy. And for the briefest moment, he swore he wasn't alone. A shadow in the corner of his vision. A whisper in the silence. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Adrian dismissed it as exhaustion. But as he played on, something incredible happened. His hands moved with a fluidity he had never experienced before, as if the music itself was guiding him. Each note felt effortless, each phrase unfolding like a story waiting to be told. Then he reached the end of the page. The melody stopped abruptly, unfinished. The last note was missing. Frustrated, Adrian searched for more information on Matthias von Richter. But the deeper he dug, the stranger it became. The man had no history, no compositions on record. It was as if he had been erased from time itself. Then he found a single reference, an old letter from 1721, written by a nobleman who had attended a private performance of von Richter's final piece. The letter's last line sent a chill down Adrian's spine. The music, it was divine, and yet I fear it was not meant for mortal ears. We who heard it that night were forever changed. Some vanished. Others lost their minds. I pray the symphony is never completed. Days later, Adrian was approached by a woman named Evelyn Moreau, a music historian who had been searching for the Lost Symphony for decades. She believed the composition had been scattered across Europe, hidden to prevent anyone from playing it in its entirety. Together, they traveled to Vienna, where the next fragment was rumored to be hidden beneath an abandoned concert hall. The underground chamber was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of time. As they searched, Adrian's heartbeat quickened. Something was here. Then, beneath a loose stone, he found it, another page. The ink was smudged, but the notes were clear. He played them that night. And the moment he did, the visions began. He saw flickering candlelight, a grand ballroom filled with men and women in powdered wigs. A harpsichord played softly in the distance. And in the center of it all stood a man, his face obscured, his fingers moving across the keys with inhuman speed. Then screaming. The vision shattered, and Adrian woke, drenched in sweat. Evelyn watched him with wary eyes. "The music is changing you," she whispered. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down he knew she was right. The last piece was said to be in Venice, buried beneath an opera house that had been swallowed by the sea centuries ago. They descended into the ruins, wading through waist-deep water in the moonlit cavern. And there, among the remnants of forgotten history, they found him, Matthias von Richter, or rather, what remained of him. His skeleton lay slumped over a submerged piano, fingers still resting on the keys. And carved into the bone of his forearm was the final note. Adrian traced it with trembling fingers, and in that moment he understood. Von Richter had never intended to finish the symphony. He had died trying to keep it from being completed. But the music, it called to Adrian, whispering its unfinished melody in his mind. The need to complete it consumed him. Even as Evelyn begged him to stop, even as the walls seemed to close in, as the very air trembled with unseen forces, he sat at the ruined piano and played. And when the final note rang out, the world shifted. The water stilled. The shadows recoiled. And for the first time in centuries, silence reigned. Adrian closed his eyes, expecting the worst. But when he opened them, he was no longer in the cavern. He was standing in the grand ballroom from his visions, candlelight dancing around him. The guests stared, their faces frozen in shock. At the piano sat Von Richter himself, eyes wide with terror. Then, the music resumed. Only now it was playing him. The chandelier lights flickered violently, and the shadows stretched unnaturally. The guests' faces contorted, some whispering soundlessly, others with tears frozen on their cheeks. Adrian tried to move to resist, but the music held him in place, like invisible chains wrapping around his soul. Von Richter's trembling hands lifted, his fingers hovering over the keys, but he did not strike them. His wide, terrified eyes met Adrian's, silently pleading. Adrian understood now. Von Richter had never played the final note. He had stopped himself. He had fought against it. And now it was Adrian's turn. His hands moved on their own, a force beyond him guiding his fingers to the final note. His breath hitched. He knew in that instant that if he played it, he would become part of the symphony. His name would vanish from history, as Von Richter's had. The world would forget him. But if he didn't, the music would find another. It always did. With the last ounce of willpower he had, Adrian clenched his fists and slammed them down, not on the keys, but on the music itself. The pages crumpled beneath his grip, and a scream unlike anything he had ever heard tore through the ballroom. The walls cracked. The guests dissolved into mist. Von Richter's face twisted in relief before vanishing into the darkness. And then silence. Adrian gasped as he found himself back in the flooded cavern, his hands empty, the sheet music reduced to nothing but dust in the water. Evelyn knelt beside him, her eyes filled with concern. "You stopped it," she whispered. Adrian swallowed hard. The weight in the air had lifted. The world had returned to normal. And yet, as they climbed out of the ruins, and the first rays of sunlight touched his face, a single thought lingered. Somewhere, buried in the forgotten corners of history, the music was waiting. And one day, someone else would find it,